I have spent the last several hours reviewing the raw signals coming out of the Strait of Hormuz, cross-referencing the ceasefire extension language out of Washington with the counter-statements being issued by Tehran's parliament advisors, and what I am looking at is not a peace process. What I am looking at is a coercive siege dressed. In the language of diplomacy, and the mainstream media is completely missing the operational reality buried inside it. Here is what the headlines are telling you. The Lebanon truce has been extended by 3 weeks. Trump says the clock is ticking for Iran and talks are scheduled for Islamabad. That sounds like progress. That sounds like de-escalation. It is neither. What the headlines are not telling you is this: the United States naval blockade of Iranian ports is still in full effect, not paused, not reduced, active. The same ceasefire extension that Trump announced explicitly preserves the blockade. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has publicly called that blockade an act of war. A senior advisor to Iran's parliament speaker called the extension meaningless and said Tehran should respond militarily. That is not the language of a party moving toward a negotiating table. That is the language of a government under existential economic pressure, with hardliners inside the IRG actively resisting any diplomatic concession. And here is the detail nobody is contextualizing correctly. Trump extended this ceasefire with no fixed end date. That sounds generous. It is not. What an open-ended extension without a deadline actually does is remove the one forcing mechanism that was pressuring both sides to move. It creates a vacuum, and in geopolitical vacuums. Around the Strait of Hormuz, the most dangerous actors are not the ones at the negotiating table. They are the ones who were never invited to it. The next 72 hours are not a pause. They are a pressure cooker, and the valve is located at the mouth of the most critical maritime chokepoint on the planet. To understand why this ceasefire extension is structurally fragile, you must first understand the geography that makes the entire situation non-negotiable for both sides. This is not a diplomatic dispute that can be resolved through conventional summit frameworks. The physical terrain itself, specifically one narrow corridor of water, dictates every military calculation, every economic threat, and every deadline that Washington and Tehran exchange. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest navigable point. Through that corridor moves approximately 20% of the world's total oil supply, 17 million barrels per day, every VLCC supertanker departing from Karg Island, every LNG carrier exiting Qatari terminals, every vessel bound for the refinery. Infrastructure of South Korea, Japan, and India transits that bottleneck. There is no pipeline alternative that can absorb that volume. There is no rerouting option that does not add weeks of transit time and hundreds of millions of dollars in additional operational cost. The strait is not a strategic asset. It is the circulatory system of the global industrial economy, and right now a significant portion of it remains choked. The operational environment inside and adjacent to the strait compounds Western naval doctrine structural vulnerabilities. The Persian Gulf itself is a shallow enclosed body of water averaging only 160 feet in depth. That depth profile fundamentally degrades the acoustic signature advantages that American nuclear-powered attack submarines depend on. Thermal layers are inconsistent, surface traffic density is extreme, and the Iranian coastline along the northeastern shore of the strait provides elevated terrain that enables land-based radar and missile battery positioning. Iranian Silkworm and Noor anti-ship missile batteries have overlapping fields of fire across the entire navigable channel. Chinese-derived C-802 anti-ship missiles, with a range envelope exceeding 120 kilometers, can engage surface targets from hardened positions well inland, outside the effective kinetic reach of carrier-based strike packages operating under current rules of engagement. This is not terrain that favors a conventional power projection doctrine. Carrier strike group operations in this environment require sustained defensive resource allocation every hour a CSG operates inside the Persian Gulf as an hour its Aegis destroyers are burning through Standard Missile-3 interceptor inventories managing the electromagnetic threat profile from the Iranian coastline. Meanwhile, the Lebanese theater adds a second front pressure variable. Israeli forces remain actively operating in the so-called security zone in southern Lebanon despite the truce. Hezbollah has paused kinetic operations, but its rocket and missile arsenal, estimated at over 150,000 projectiles, remains fully intact, dispersed across hardened positions in the Bekaa Valley and southern Lebanese civilian infrastructure. That arsenal is not a deterrent. It is a loaded second strike capability. This is not terrain that favors a conventional power projection doctrine. Carrier strike group operations in this environment require sustained defensive resource allocation every hour a CSG operates inside the Persian Gulf as an hour its Aegis destroyers are burning through Standard Missile-3 interceptor inventories managing the electromagnetic threat profile from the Iranian coastline. Meanwhile, the Lebanese theater adds a second front pressure variable. Israeli forces remain actively operating in the so-called security zone in southern Lebanon despite the truce. Hezbollah has paused kinetic operations, but its rocket and missile arsenal, estimated at over 150,000 projectiles, remains fully intact, dispersed across hardened positions in the Bekaa Valley and southern Lebanese civilian infrastructure. That arsenal is not a deterrent. It is a loaded second strike capability waiting for a tripwire. Washington is simultaneously managing two geographically separated but operationally linked theaters, while enforcing a naval blockade against a nation of 90 million people that has publicly called that blockade an act of war. The physics and geography of this situation do not favor a clean diplomatic resolution inside any 72-hour window. The operational mechanics of the United States naval blockade of Iranian ports represent one of the most complex and legally ambiguous coercive instruments deployed by any Western power in the post-Cold War era. To understand its fragility and why the next 72 hours carry disproportionate escalation risk, it is necessary to break down exactly what the blockade consists of, what Iran's asymmetric countermeasure doctrine looks like, and where the specific tripwires for kinetic escalation are positioned. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, headquartered at Naval Support Activity Bahrain, currently maintains a surface action group presence at both the northern and southern approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. This positioning is designed to enforce cargo interdiction specifically to prevent refined petroleum products, dual-use industrial materials, and weapons system components from entering Iranian territorial waters. The enforcement mechanism relies on combined maritime patrol operations integrating P-8 Poseidon maritime surveillance aircraft operating out of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, alongside MQ for seat right and high-altitude and manned surveillance platforms providing persistent, wide-area coverage of vessel traffic across the entire Gulf region. Every Iranian-flagged or Iran-destined vessel is being tracked, interrogated via automatic identification system transponder data, and where necessary, intercepted by embarked Navy VBS visit, board, search, and seizure teams. This is textbook naval coercion doctrine, and against a conventional adversary with a blue-water navy, it would be functionally decisive. Iran is not that adversary. Iran's counter-blockade doctrine is built on three asymmetric pillars that collectively make sustained naval enforcement geometrically more expensive over time. The first pillar is mine warfare. The IRG Navy maintains an inventory of both contact and influence mines, including indigenously produced variants of the Soviet Lug M145, and the more sophisticated M52 rocket-propelled mine that can be deployed from fast attack craft, submarines, and even commercial Dow-class vessels operating under civilian electromagnetic profiles. Trump's order directing the U.S. Navy to shoot and kill any Iranian vessels detected placing mines in the strait is a direct acknowledgement that this threat is not theoretical, it is active. The operational challenge is detection and attribution. At night, in high-traffic shallow water, distinguishing a mine-laying fast boat from a standard fishing vessel requires persistent ISR coverage with zero sensor gaps. That coverage does not currently exist at the density required. The second pillar is swarm tactics. The IRG naval aviation and fast boat fleet operates on a distributed, decentralized engagement model. Squadrons of Seraj-class and Zolfaghar-class fast attack craft, capable of speeds exceeding 70 knots, are designed to execute saturation attacks against surface combatants from multiple vectors. Simultaneously, the tactical objective is not to defeat a CSG in a conventional engagement, it is to overwhelm the point defense systems of individual escorts long enough to achieve a mission kill on a high-value surface asset. One successful mission kill on a U.S. destroyer inside the strait triggers an immediate escalation ladder that no diplomatic framework currently in place has a mechanism to descend from. The third pillar is the Shahab and Hoveyzeh ballistic missile inventory, combined with the Hoveyzeh and attack cruise missile. These are not weapons designed for naval interdiction. They are designed for rapid retaliatory strikes against fixed infrastructure, specifically the offshore oil platforms of Saudi Arabia and the desalination facilities of the Arabian Peninsula, and the forward operating bases housing US personnel across Bahrain, Qatar, and the IRG's doctrine explicitly frames these systems as a second strike punishment capability. The message being transmitted to Gulf Cooperation Council states is operationally clear: if you are hosting the infrastructure, enabling the blockade of Iranian ports, your critical national infrastructure is inside the engagement envelope. What makes this tactical picture acutely dangerous right now is the internal fracture within Iranian command authority that Washington has publicly identified. Trump stated explicitly that the U.S. does not know who the decision-making authority inside Tehran currently is. That is not a rhetorical device. That is a genuine intelligence assessment reflecting the reality that the assassination of Supreme Leader Khamenei earlier in this conflict decapitated the singular command node that historically served as the ultimate escalation control mechanism inside the IRG. Without that singular authority, local IRG naval commanders operating fast attack craft in the northern Gulf are operating under rules of engagement that may not be synchronized with whatever negotiating position Iran's foreign ministry is attempting to construct in Islamabad. That command disconnect is the most dangerous single variable in the entire operational environment. Decentralized command authority combined with active mine warfare operations and a standing shoot-to-kill order from the U.S. Navy is not a stable equilibrium. It is a single miscalculation away from a kinetic exchange that neither diplomatic track currently has the architecture to contain. The military mechanics described above do not remain contained within the Persian Gulf. They transmit instantaneously into the global macroeconomic system through four specific channels: energy markets, maritime insurance, supply chain pricing, and sovereign debt exposure across emerging market economies. Each channel is already under measurable stress. A single kinetic escalation event inside the Strait of Hormuz does not merely spike an oil price chart. It structurally reprices risk across the entire global trading system for a minimum of 90 to 120 days. Begin with the energy market signal. Brent crude was already trading above $101 per barrel in the hours before Trump announced the ceasefire extension. The moment the extension was confirmed, prices pulled back to approximately $98. That $3 swing on a single social media post is the market's real-time confession that the entire price structure of global crude is currently being held hostage to the diplomatic temperature inside one conversation between Washington and Tehran. A confirmed mine strike on a U.S. naval vessel, or a successful IRGC fast boat attack that achieves even a mission kill on an escort destroyer, would not produce a $3 swing. Independent energy analysts and Gulf petroleum strategists are modeling an immediate Brent crude spike to the $130 to $145 range under a partial strait closure scenario. Under a full closure scenario lasting more than 2 weeks, the modeling extends to $160 and beyond. At that price level, the inflationary transmission into Western consumer economies is not gradual, it is immediate and structural. The maritime insurance dimension compounds the energy shock through a separate but parallel mechanism. Lloyd's of London and the broader Joint War Committee already have the entire Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, and the Northern Arabian Sea listed as war risk zones. Vessels transiting those waters are currently paying war risk premium surcharges that have increased by an estimated 300 to 500% compared to pre-conflict baseline rates. A kinetic escalation event does not merely increase those premiums further, it triggers blanket coverage suspension clauses that give underwriters the right to withdraw coverage entirely with 48 hours notice. When coverage suspends, vessels stop moving. When vessels stop moving across a corridor carrying 20% of global oil supply and significant volumes of LNG, the physical commodity does not arrive at the refinery. The refinery cannot produce the fuel. The fuel does not reach the distribution network. That sequence takes approximately 3 weeks to fully transmit into consumer pump prices across North America and Europe, but the futures market prices it in within 48 hours of a confirmed suspension event. The third transmission channel is the sovereign debt exposure of oil import-dependent emerging market economies. Nations including Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines collectively import enormous volumes of Gulf crude. Their foreign exchange reserves are already under structural pressure from the post-pandemic debt cycle. A sustained $130 per barrel oil price environment does not create a recession risk for these economies. It creates a balance of payments crisis, currency depreciation, emergency IMF intervention, and domestic political instability follow in sequence. The geopolitical irony is acute. Pakistan is currently serving as the primary diplomatic mediator between Washington and Tehran, while simultaneously being among the most economically vulnerable nations to the consequences of a failed mediation. The fourth and most structurally significant consequence is the accelerating erosion of the petrodollar architecture. Iran's counterproposal explicitly demands international recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. That demand is not a negotiating position, it is a direct challenge to the foundational premise of the post-1973 American strategic presence in the Gulf, the premise that the United States Navy guarantees freedom of navigation as a global public good. If Tehran extracts even a partial concession on Hormuz sovereignty through this negotiating process, the signal transmitted to Beijing, Moscow, and every other revisionist power operating inside the current international order is that the unipolar guarantee of open sea lanes is no longer unconditional, that reprices not just oil, it reprices the entire architecture of dollar-denominated global trade. I want to leave you with the dilemma that I cannot resolve, and that no analyst in Washington, London, or Islamabad has a clean answer to right now. Washington has 2 paths in front of it. The first path is to maintain the blockade, hold the pressure, and wait for Tehran's fractured leadership to produce a unified negotiating position. The risk is that the IRGC's decentralized naval commanders produce a kinetic incident before that unified position ever arrives in Washington. Finds itself in a full escalation ladder with no diplomatic architecture capable of stopping the climb. The second path is to soften the blockade, give Iran's moderates the breathing room to consolidate authority, and move toward Islamabad with something resembling a negotiable framework. The risk there is that Tehran reads any softening as structural weakness, pockets the concession, and uses the additional time to reconstitute exactly the capabilities that the strikes were designed to permanently degrade. There is no clean option. There is only risk management inside an environment where the command and control architecture on one side of this conflict is, by Washington's own admission, unknown. That is the operational reality nobody is briefing you on. Drop your tactical assessment in the comments below. If Tehran cannot produce a unified proposal before this open-ended extension collapses under its own pressure, what happens next? I want to read your analysis. If this briefing gave you something the mainstream coverage did not, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Tomorrow's briefing is already in motion, and the next development in this theater will not wait for a convenient headline.